this evening we are addressing ourselves to a most interesting figure, the scholar of Romanian birth, Mircea Eliade. When Mircea Eliade, as my little Romanian that I remember, which is mostly composed of references to vampires, and things of that description. In any event, when he died in 1986, Time magazine, as I remember, and I was somewhat startled, devoted a lengthy obituary to him, in which it was noted that he single-handedly changed the nature and the status of religious studies in the United States. So he was a man greatly revered by many academics, particularly those who were teaching religious studies. What the article alluded to was the fact that religious studies, or as they might be called, the study of religion, was shunned by all publicly funded religious institutions at that time, because such studies were regarded as inevitably inviting sectarian religious controversy and contravening the cherished principle of the separation of church and state. Now, Mircea Eliade convinced and that takes some convincing, he convinced the politicians in the United States that that religion is a subject in its own right, with a legitimacy of an academic nature, and that it can be studied apart from, let's say, sectarian doctrines and allegiances. So for a few decades there was a really high excitement and interest in the majority of academic institutions in the United States concerning religious studies. But you know what comes around goes around, and the opposition to religious studies in schools now has won out again. And now it's won out on the different auspices, and I read in a journal some time ago that the religious studies in the United States have now declined tremendously, and these were the reasons or the features that they listed. First of all, that there are no basic sources for religious studies, not even sacred scriptures. Curious. Then another one was that God is gone. Now that's somebody should write a book like that. You know, there were some theologians in Stanford way back who wrote a book called God is Dead, which is of course a quotation from Nietzsche. But this one, that he's gone, is particularly interesting. And that God is gone, primarily the monotheistic God. So maybe when there are many of them, the chances of one surviving are greater. This we must consider. The next point was that people consider themselves not religious, although sometimes spiritual. And of course my great big question is, what's the difference? And finally, the last point, that religion is not interesting anymore because people have lost interest in religion and in God, which is of course just an explanation of the former. So as I say, you may, as the Romans were wont to say in Latin, in one of their many proverbs, naturam expellas furca tamen usque recurret. You can chase out nature with a pitchfork, but she will come back just the same. So here we are not talking about nature such as, I don't know, what are you chasing out of from your house? Well, pretty soon we are going to have to chase out the ants again, who are very prolific around here. Whether you chase out the insects or whether you chase out the plants or anything of that sort, but in this case, they have chased out one of the natural functions, let us say, of human consciousness, which is the religious sense, and they brought it back, and now they chased it out again. A curious and curiouser, strange situation. While undoubtedly true, these accomplishments, in that particular great accomplishment of Mircea Eliade, was only one of many. One thing that may be a little more alive in our memories is the fact that in the 1960s he became very famous because of his book on shamanism, which is just entitled Shamanism, and which became really the standard source for studies of the shamanistic phenomenon. And of course, as you may recall, partly as the result of the presence of and use of psychedelic substances and various other circumstances, that was a period when a good number of people became interested in shamanism, and Mircea Eliade was their principal source. And there again, he had an approach to shamanism that none of the previous authorities in the field had. So let's say his contribution to the entire religious, philosophical, mythological world was unique and extremely impressive. I'm happy to say, as I was preparing this talk, I looked to my increasingly numerous and untidy collection of books, and I found that I have, I think, no less than 15 books of Mircea Eliade on my shelf. If for the rest of my increasingly long life I should decide to read only Mircea Eliade, I think I should be able to do it, considering the sources. But they are really all very unique and all very interesting. Now, in our little series of discussions here about the great mythologists of the 20th century, Mircea Eliade really occupies a unique position, at least in one respect, and that is that all the other great mythologists, some of whom we have spoken about already, Joseph Campbell, Carl Carigny next time, Heinrich Zimmer, and one we didn't really talk about, the sinologist, the Chinese scholar Richard Wilhelm, because he wasn't really that much devoted to Chinese mythology, as he was the great translator of the I Ching, and he co-authored The Secret of the Golden Flower with Jung, but so I didn't include him this time. But let's say all of these people were closely associated with Carl Jung. The one who continued to insist till the end of his days that he was not a Jungian was Mircea Eliade. Not to imply thereby that he was very very interested in Jung, and he participated in a number of the Eranos conferences in Ascona, in Switzerland, and those wonderful things where Jung gathered sort of the creme de la creme of the intellect and of the spirit of Europe of that time, and they had these wonderful get-togethers at the Villa Eranos on the shore of the, is that the Lago Maggiore? I think it is. And certainly Mircea Eliade participated in a number of those. And if you ever come across, fortunately I have them too, I think it's probably 5 or 6 volumes, big thick ones, which are the transactions really of all the lectures that were given at the Eranos conferences. The entire series was edited by then quite very young Joseph Campbell, and you can find in those volumes numerous really very splendid lectures, transcribed lectures by Mircea Eliade. Now, but he had good reasons, which I will try to convey to you. In fact, that is, I would say, that is really the most important keynote that one can sound about Mircea Eliade, and I'll try to convey to you. He had a very important and we might say highly personal reason for distancing himself from the psychological approach. And some of that, I think, is really something that we need to consider also. But at the same time, he did feel that Jung made an extremely important contribution, and he was very, very friendly to and very reverential toward Dr. Jung. Why would this one man of the whole bouquet of mythological scholars had that particular attitude? And it's maybe not all that easy to discover, but to a far greater extent than the others whom I just mentioned, Mircea Eliade possessed his own considerable gnosis. And that is really what I want to call attention to, if I succeed with sufficient force. Something that he experienced, something that was within him, and that he communicated in his own unique way. Another issue, which we might say separated Eliade to some extent from Jung and those influenced by Jung, was the nature of emphasis which needs to be mentioned. At the risk of oversimplification, it could be said that Jung and the Jungian mythologists all inherited, and certainly true, I don't know, certainly true of the Jungian analysts right up to this day. I think it was minimally present, for instance, in Joseph Campbell, but let's say they all inherited a certain psychological bias or emphasis that originated in depth psychology. Now, after all, Jung was a psychologist, and he never regarded himself as anything else. And scholars such as Carigny and Zimmer and Campbell were not, let's say, they were not bothered by that, quite to the contrary. But there was an important issue, and that was, I'll just very, very briefly allude to that. You know, particularly in his the early period of his career, Jung, being a medical doctor and an associate of Sigmund Freud, and then really one of the 2 or 3 greatest depth psychologists, being Freud himself and Alfred Adler, had, let's say, obviously expressed a strong emphasis on the, how should I put it, on the present inadequacies of human consciousness and its possible future expansion by way of a new model of the depth psychological model of the psyche. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but as Mircea Eliade had discovered, let us say, and that may actually be a slight exaggeration, that there was, that Jung and the Jungians, I agree with as far as most of the Jungians are concerned, but not about Jung himself, that they were still somewhat excessively influenced by the how should we put it, the historico-psychological model of evolution. Now, what do I mean by that? You know, beginning with Charles Darwin and his giant turtles and whatever else he rounded up down there at the Terra del Fuego and so forth, you know, evolution was a buzzword for at least 100 years, if not more, in the intellectual life of the West. I always regretted, and I still do, and my friends know it, my theosophical friends, there's too much jabberwocky about evolution in theosophy. And it only was because when Madame Blavatsky and her associates were doing their initial work, you know, evolution was a word to conjure with. You know, but since then a lot of things happened in the world, and many of them, some pretty bad ones, are still happening right now, and somehow I think the evolutionary paradigm has waned in its influence, and I think it's a good idea. But let us say, so therefore, underlying, let us say, if you want to look at it that way, the depth psychological view of these matters is the contention that with some effort on the part of psychologists and psychiatrists and the so-called patients themselves, the patient can evolve into consciousness. And so that there is a potential within us of a greater consciousness, which certainly as psychologists were always hoping to somehow extricate from the human ego. Now, that's not a contention that's wrong, but I think it's a notion that is limited. But to blame C.G. Jung for that limitation, I think, is also extremely unjust. And you know where that injustice can be refuted best from? The Red Book, or Liber Novus, which of course was published only a long time after Jung's death, and now the sort of additional volumes of the so-called Black Book, because already from the Red Book you can see that this man was not interested in that kind of coaxing of human consciousness into existence, but that he was overwhelmed by the magnitude and the power of the human psyche and its origins and its possible future, in a manner which is far more mystical, and you might say, if you don't mind that term, far more religious in nature than was hitherto suspected. So that Jung is now revealed as a visionary of major proportions and of tremendous power. And while Mircea Eliade never called himself a visionary, but if you read some of his books and you detect the motivating force in his approach to religious and spiritual traditions, whether they are shamanism or whether they are anything else, you can see that behind all of these statements, behind all of these scholarly disclosures, there is a man of vision. More than that, there is a man of knowing, a man of gnosis, and that certainly Jung was another one, although they worked, let's say, in two different fields. But maybe in order to see what field and in what manner Mircea Eliade worked, it might be good for us to have a very brief biography of him, which I'll give you this time. He was born in Bucharest in 1907. He was educated at University of Bucharest, where he received a PhD in 1932, and at the University of Calcutta, where he studied for several years. The circumstances of his journey to India and his experiences in India I will come around to very shortly, because they are quite interesting and quite absolutely romantic. So his first publications were fiction, and he produced both scholarly works and fiction over the course of some 60 years of writing. So I know a little bit about writing, and I know that 60 years of it, it would kill me much earlier than the 60 years. But let's see, he taught at the École des Hautes Études in Paris. He lectured at the universities of Rome, Marburg, Munich, Frankfurt, Padua, Lund and Strasbourg, before settling at the University of Chicago, where he was, technically speaking, he had the endowed chair, the Sewell L. Avery Distinguished Service Professor in the Divinity School and professor in the Committee on Social Thought. He still occupied all of these positions at the time of his death in April 1986. He was the author of some 50 books, so that brings me down a little bit, because I only have a fraction of those 50. But as I say, I'm happy I have quite a few of them. He was the author of some 50 books, including novels, short stories, plays, as well as works in the history of religion. So you can see a man of very diverse interests and talents. He even wrote some theatrical plays, as well as, of course, all his works on the history of religions. His books, published by the University of Chicago Press, are a huge, big 3-volume history of religious ideas. Another one, a very imaginative one, called Ordeal by Labyrinth, The Forge and the Crucible, which is about alchemy, Occultism, Witchcraft, and Cultural Fashions, which speak for themselves, The Quest, The Two and the One, and Zalmoxis, the Vanishing God, The History of Religions, which he wrote in collaboration with the Japanese scholar Joseph Kitagawa, and the novel The Old Man and the Bureaucrats. You know, that was almost something that could be written right at this very moment. And I won't identify either the old man or the bureaucrats, but they'll use it to your vivid and probably very accurate imagination. He died in Chicago in 1986. And while I, to my great regret, I never had met him in the flesh, I knew at least 4 people who were personally pupils of his at the University of Chicago, and they had the greatest, overwhelming respect of him, truly. Now, of course, like all important people in the history of the world, he had his enemies. So he was accused of all kinds of things, and I will not mention all kinds of things, but let's say one of them being that he, first of all, you know, he was a youthful genius, and it somehow works out that way. I never considered myself a genius, whether when I was young, and especially not now. But let's say, even if you are just maybe extra smart when you're young, you know, and we all think, at least we think we are extra smart when we are young, you always get people who are going to dislike you. They will dislike you because you are young, and they are usually anything but young. They dislike you if you are good looking. Oh, that's a big sin in the eyes of a lot of people. And they will dislike you if you are smart. I mean, this, I don't know why this is, but let's say it's a very definitely present psychological fact. And so he had his critics right off the bat. But you can, as we say in Transylvania, which is Romania also now, the bat, you know. In any event, he was probably the best known and most controversial young intellectual of his generation. In between World War I and World War II in Romania. He was a newspaper columnist, a novelist, a lecturer who virtually established the history of religion and Indology, the study of India and Indian thought. All of these academic disciplines were his métier, as we call it in French, were his field very early in his life. So from 1928 until 1931, he lived in India, and that's quite a story in itself. And there are several versions, and some of them are more wild and sort of 1960-ish in nature at that early period, and others are not. And I don't know which one I should repeat, but the fact of the matter is that he, when 21 years old, went to India, and he got in touch with a professor of religious studies in India, a Professor Sunendranath Dasgupta, and he was patronized in terms of he had a scholarship given to him by the Maharaja of Kasyam Bazar, which is a beautiful name right there, and as he was there from 28 to 31, so it's quite a few years. Well, everybody, all the all the romanticizers and the critics agree that Professor Dasgupta had a beautiful and very young daughter, and that Mircea Eliade and he, let's say, struck up a relationship. Her name was Maitreyi Dasgupta. The stories are contradictory, but in any event, Eliade, the young Eliade, stayed at Professor Dasgupta's house, which habitation, I suppose, was very helpful for romance, and so ultimately Professor Dasgupta became very suspicious of the young Romanian scholar and his relationship to his daughter, and then for a while, according to one of the stories, the young couple eloped from wherever they had been residing, and that there was a wild chase of the irate father chasing the young couple all up and down India to various places. So, you know, I like scholars like that. This puts the professorial professions into a much more exciting perspective than otherwise might be the case. In any event, by 1931, he sort of couldn't stay in India anymore, and he returned to Romania. In 1933, only 2 years later, he published a short romantic novel which was entitled Maitreyi, the name of his his girlfriend from whom he now was separated. He became associated with the existential philosopher Nae Ionescu, who is possibly a relative of to us much more better known Eugene Ionescu, and so he was already at that time a young, extremely brilliant intellectual, like most intellectuals in those days, in the 1930s and thereabouts, of strong existentialist leanings, and eventually, after going through some other experiences, he became a diplomat, or was in the diplomatic corps of Romania, and he became a cultural attaché at the Romanian embassies, first in London and eventually in Lisbon, in Portugal. And he served in that capacity until 1945, during World War II. Now, what you got to remember is that he was in Lisbon, and Lisbon, Portugal, was one of the few neutral countries, along with Switzerland and Spain, during the war. So he could maintain diplomatic relations with various countries because they were neutral in the war. So that was really a good place to be. He was in Lisbon, and he served in that capacity till 1945, the end of World War II, when he became a full-time academic, first in Paris and then in the windy city of Chicago. In the USA, he single-handedly changed, as I mentioned earlier, for a considerable period of time, the course of religious studies. Now, what approach did he have to myth, shall we say? As far as I am aware, Eliade never derived the never denied the existence, for instance, of the importance of the Jungian recognitions, but his insights led him to recognitions of a somewhat different and perhaps more expansive order. Eliade looked upon the human not primarily as a victim of internal fragmentation, as people felt that Jung did. See, once again, now we know a good deal more because of the Red Book and so forth. Jung knew a heck of a lot more than he put into most of his books. And now with our knowledge of the content of the Red Book and to some extent of the Black Books, we literally can and must read between the lines in his, what's it, about 17, 18 volumes of collected writings. And among them, of course, is the understanding that when he one of his very early approaches to Jung now, of the human psyche was that we are not united inside. We have multiple autonomous complexes. You might say part selves or part souls within us. And that if you are around people, especially the same people for a while and get to know them, you find out that they are sure multiple psyches. You don't have to suffer from a complex of multiple personality, but we are all many people, and that's why we are such a pain in the neck to each other. If there were a real unitary person there who will always do this, never do that, that would be great. I think there would be fewer divorces, there would be, all kinds of unpleasant things would be absent, but such is not the case. And so Jung emphasized, especially in his early career, that we have to be put together, that these autonomous complexes have to come together into a unified wholeness. And he insisted on that subsequently also, but let us say you could see that this approach, while quite accurate as far as it went, really had deeper roots. And those deeper roots were many of the visions, the disclosures, the amazing mythos which was present in the Red Book, which of course contained his visionary experiences. And it's just because of this great disparity between, let's say, what the public in the early part of the 20th century, or for that matter probably most of the 20th century, was willing to consider, and on the other hand, what Jung had really discovered, the difference was great. And so he had to express himself in a manner acceptable not only to the, let's say, the mental health profession, but really to the intellectual tenure of the 20th century. Well, he was born in the end of the last 20, he was born in 1875, Carl Jung was, so he already had 25 years into the 19th century, but it would have been, as he very well knew, it would have been disastrous for him to reveal the kind of experiences of which he gives an account in the Red Book, probably during most of his life, and so he was careful with it. In fact, I'm talking more about Carl Jung, about Mircea, than Mircea Eliade, but don't worry, we'll come back to him. Let's say it would have been disastrous, but at the same time he really spent much of his writing career, Jung again, which is many volumes of his collected writings. He spent much of his writing careers really translating his visionary interior experiences, his altered states, the results of his altered states of consciousness into a format and into a language that would not be too offensive to the intellectual circles of his time. And he had a heck of a time with that, very difficult. That's why people were so amazed, and I remember that period myself, as why is this man writing so much about alchemy? Isn't he supposed to be a psychologist? By which they meant, isn't he supposed to be a shrink? And yet he writes about alchemy all the time. Well, of course, we know now why he wrote about it. But let's say, Mircea Eliade has an excellent, fabulous book on alchemy called The Forge and the Crucible. It gives you a little different take on alchemy than most of the others, but a very, very good one. So now Mircea Eliade, just like we said that Joseph Campbell's myth, of his own myth, was really the hero of not only the journey, the hero's journey, but it was really the mystery, the psycho-spiritual mystery of love. And so each one of these people, Heinrich Zimmer and others, had a particular keynote to which they were attached to. Well, Mircea Eliade was attached to a view of reality which, as we find, one really has to look for it. You will find strong indications of its beginnings in his autobiography. And this was and is and remained a conviction, which was really the matrix of his thought, of himself and of consequently of humanity being exiled from a sacred matrix. Humanity fallen out of a timeless state of being and having been cast into a nameless terror, to which euphemistic names like time and history have been given. Now you can detect a little bit here the influence of the more pessimistic existentialists, who certainly had a strong feeling about the terror of history and the terror of time. But he was much more than an existentialist. But he had much contact with them, because that was the most open philosophy, let us say, that was available when he was young and he was at the height of his powers. He saw, like the existentialists, but I think on a much more profound level, that an alienation from a timeless reality and an enmeshment in history are the factors that cause the existential terror from which consciously or unconsciously most humans suffer. So, of course, that is very much of an existentialist insight. You find it among the the greatest existentialist philosophers. Of course, the problem is that Rome had, like every school of thought, which is not a closed school of thought, has people in it who, let's say, shouldn't be there, and who are giving the school of thought a bad name. And that's what happened to the existentialists with what in German we could call Dummkopf, which means stupid head. Dummkopfs like Jean-Paul Sartre and some others, everything is bound to go wrong. And it did. But let's say someone like Eliade, on the hand, could pick up some of the existentialist paradigm and make something very important and really very spiritual out of it. So I vowed that even though I have all these books by Eliade, that I'm not going to quote him much, because for one thing there are so many wonderful things there that if we quoted even a goodly portion of them, we would be here all night, or rather I would be here all night and you would have skedaddled out. So therefore I didn't do that. So I'll just try to describe a little bit in my own words. In his autobiography, he describes a wonderful scene when he was a little boy. I don't even, in Bucharest, I don't even know how old he was, although I think he mentions it there. And he came into a big, ornate, beautiful, but somewhat darkened living room of his parents. They were well-off business people, I think, in Bucharest. And all of a sudden, something hit him, and he was never the same thereafter. What he was transported by way. I said what sort of took him there was this strange constellation of lights in that room. Apparently it was in the summertime, and Bucharest in the summertime can be pretty doggone hot, and so can Budapest. What people did in those days, I mean, this would have been 1930s, somewhere there, around the time of the date of my birth, incidentally. So there was certainly a long time before air conditioning, so they would keep, in the summertime, they would keep the rooms draped, and so they were dark. We did that in our house too, but at the same time there was always some light that penetrated, and it gave rise to a sort of very interesting vision of reality in these cases, and that's what he had at that time. And so it hit him at that time as a little boy that this is not the world where we belong, that he and the rest of humanity have come to have come from a world of wonder, from a world of beauty and glory and light, and that we have gotten caught in a world that is very different from and very inferior to that. And he said, this is the issue. What we are doing is, he didn't use those terms, of course, the American expression, we humans in the history are forever barking up the wrong tree. And of course Jung would say we do that because of extroversion. We are always looking for the cause of our difficulties and our unhappiness and so forth in various, in our attempted dealing with external circumstances, where while we have lost completely sight of the big picture. The big picture being that we come from a consciousness of wonder, of marvel, and of beauty, and of goodness, but we find ourselves in a place that is very different from and very inferior to that. And this is the great existential predicament. But as Jung would say, owing to the extraversion of our culture and the way we are indoctrinated, we are always looking for the causes of our difficulties outside of ourselves. Well, actually, it's the change that has occurred in our consciousness which needs to be undone. And that is the important issue. And he came to that conclusion, no doubt, in the way of the consciousness of a child when he was very little, and he never lost it. He said, that is the real picture. The real picture is that we are capable of, and we come from, an exalted consciousness, and we have been confined in anything but exalted, lowly and difficult, the terror of time and the terror of history. So that is how he came by really his worldview. And this, of course, is extremely important. Now, in the Jungian model, we are developing, so he felt, developing toward the self. We are growing, we are trying to transform. Eliade, on the other hand, saw all throughout his life an existential predicament. Human consciousness as an exile, trying to cope with and ultimately to overcome the terrible, alienating, bewildering condition of being caught in time and condemned to experience the terror of history. So to get out of a cosmic predicament wherein we find ourselves, and we find ourselves incidentally for no fault of our own. So this is where he, let's say, contradicted the Augustinian, which I think is the Augustinian corruption of biblical religion, wherein there is the original sin, which not only is at the origins, but which everybody inherits. I mean, really, St. Augustine of Hippo should be excoriated for that. But anyway, you know, that is obviously not there. Otherwise, it could be made to be compatible with that. But let's say it is to get out of a cosmic predicament wherein we find ourselves through no fault of our own. This is our heart's true desire. This is what everybody really desires, but doesn't know it. And I think that's a really amazing and very important recognition. The world, and then now we come to him as in his approach to myth, the world's great myths are largely motivated by our soul's desire to get out of this predicament. Now, this is rather different from most of the others. So he had a vision from the time that he was a child of a primordial world of beatitude and light. Those are actually his words, the primordial world of beatitude and light. No doubt reinforced by his exile are ways in which we try to remove ourselves from what he called the profane and return to the sacred, from the slavery of time and from the terror of history to a consciousness of timeless reality. That this view of course, as those of us who are interested in that particular tradition, is a profoundly Gnostic one, goes almost without saying. So having stated this unique proposition of Eliade, we may now take a little look at, which we have already done, at his career, and we can see that he continued to pursue this vision in various ways. And this is where his great dislike, let us say, one of his great dislike, I'm sure he had more than one, was the myopic vision of much of 20th century philosophy, perhaps even religion, and certainly politics, which always saw the causes of the human difficulties, the causes of the predicament in external or relatively external circumstances. Now you compare this with a little bit with the psychology. See, Freud saw the cause of human unhappiness and malfunction in what? In maladjustment to society, primarily sexual maladjustment, you know. Now Jung saw beyond that. And Jung knew, I am convinced, I mean this is of course a personal statement, that Jung knew what Mircea Eliade knew, but because of his position in the world, he could not bring it forth in a forthright manner in his lifetime. It was there in the Red Book, it is there in the Red Book and in the others. So in 1924, Eliade, for instance, wrote his first novel, and he was really young then, entitled The Novel of a Nearsighted Adolescent. So he was really pretty much of an adolescent when he wrote it. He was probably nearsighted. I don't have any information about that. But in that novel, he already incorporated this vision. By this time, he was a regular columnist for the daily newspaper and a truly well-known figure in Romania, especially among the younger generation. I mentioned his excursion to India and the things that went there. So the reason for mentioning all this is the recurring the various recurring unjustified accusations, primarily publicized after his death, because you know it's always so easy to malign a dead man or woman. Why? Because they can't talk back. You know, they can't contradict you. And so one of the accusations was that in his young days that he was a fascist. Well, first of all, there were no fascists in Romania because the very word fascismo is an Italian phenomenon. But he did sympathize with a Romanian sort of nationalist movement, which later on was forbidden by King Carol, which was called the Iron Guard or the Legion of Saint Michael. But let us say there also what he really was. And the reason he sympathized with these romantic movements only for a short time, and they wouldn't have taken him into the diplomatic service if any of that had been right. But the reason that he sympathized with this was because he felt that the great enemy of what we would call human consciousness was collectivism. And that the collectivist ideologies, which were certainly rampant and which took over in the form of Marxism, Leninism, took over Russia and all kinds of other things, that these were the real menace of the modern age. And why? Because they drew away from the necessary recognitions whereby we might recover our original beatific condition. Because if the problem is all out there, it's with the social structure, it's with the distribution of property, it's with these external things, then we will be engaged in that rather than taking a look at what we ought to take a look at, which is our inner self and how we might connect our inner self with that greater marvelous conditions from whence we came. So he really, let's say, he really and truly pinpointed the primary difficulty of modern, and now they would call it postmodern humanity, as being extroversion, as Jung would call it, as collectivism, as looking for the causes of our difficulty outside, and the ignoring of our heart's desire, which is the desire for the greater, the desire for enlightenment, the desire for return to that primeval beatific consciousness that he contacted in his parents' living room, and without which there is no way out of the predicament. And I agree with him. I mean, of course, there are various ways of applying this in the various details, but the issue really is that we live in a reality which is a distraction. The entire reality of humanity is a distraction, because what we consider to be real is not truly real. And the real, shall we say, we don't discover, because we are diverted, we digress, we are shown a false reality which is made to look like not being false. And of course this put him totally at odds with communism and the communist regime in Romania, which was one of the worst, you know, and there definitely was a time when it seems that the Ceausescu dictatorial regime was looking for him here in America. But instead of that, they murdered one of his best disciples, another young Romanian student at the University of Chicago, Ioan Culianu, who was murdered by the agents of the communist government of Romania in a bathroom at the University of Chicago. If they're going to murder me, don't murder me in a bathroom, you know, come on. Let's have a little more elegant surroundings here. In any event, what you really have here is a scholar who was and really put forth a transcendental vision which he constantly reiterated and proved in various ways in his book. So that's why he wrote that truly insightful and very influential book on shamanism, because he said the so-called primitive shaman still has a memory. He still has a connection with that greater beatific world. He doesn't think that by building a factory or by changing a government or by changing an economic system he will fulfill his heart's desire. He knows what his heart's desire is. His heart's desire is the transcendental, the greater world. And so he looked for that. Look, he says, the alchemists were doing the same thing. Various other people were doing the same thing. Magicians and witches and things like that in their own way were doing the same thing. But that is where we need to look. Without it, we will remain miserable, unhappy creatures. But if we really work on it, and if we open ourselves to that influence, and we look for the means whereby this might be brought closer to us and accomplished, then all of a sudden we will say. And I think that there are people in this room, I'm not going to name them, not even going to name myself. That would be a silly thing to do, wouldn't it? There are people in this room who had, and maybe will have again, that confrontation. Look, there is something greater. There is a truly beatific reality, and it is not something really new to us. It is something that we already know. It is an existential state of which we have a memory. And so somewhat like the ancient Greeks and Romans who said that learning the true and the real things is remembering. If learning is remembering, then we need to learn about these things so that we might remember the authentic reality. And so throughout all the study of the history of religions and religious spiritual movements runs this thread. There are some there who know. There are some there who are looking for that kind of knowing. And that has always been in the world, and it is still there, but we need to come to recognize it. And so by way of the history of spirituality in the world, he was trying to prove, look, it was always there. Look, these people were doing it, those people were doing it, somebody else there was doing it. And so let's not get caught in the mundane. Let's not get caught in the political, in the economic, in the Marxism or kind of things like this, because these are distractions, these are deviations, these are ways in which we are drawn away from the one and only true path to the realization, as he used that term, of our heart's desire. That ultimately this is really all that is important. Now, of course, we have to stay alive, and if he didn't want to stay alive, then he would have stayed in Romania under Ceausescu. That was a great way not to be alive, But this is something that really the striving, the desirous, those who really felt their heart's desire were always seeking and occasionally were realizing. So why not follow them? Why not go in that fashion? And this of course was his message. And this was the affinity that he felt with those who were seeking for the same kind of things, like Jung, even though he didn't like the psychological approach because he felt that it was too therapeutic. We don't need to be freed from our neurosis. This is the sort of thing what he said. Because we are not crazy, but we are just alienated from the real. You see? But the psychologist thinks that we're all crazy. So we either do it with analysis and things like the depth psychology started, and now we do it with nothing but pills. Now that the psychological profession has increasingly turned into the pill-pushing profession, but again, it's something external. Well, I guess it's supposed it becomes physiologically internal when you take it inside of you, but it is still a distraction, you see. So it's not that we are, Freud said we are maladjusted, primarily sexually. We are maladjusted we can't function in society because we are maladjusted bunch. Adler said very much the same thing, only with a different motivation. Jung, of course, moved away from that and said we have to discover the deeper archetypes and so on. This is really goes along quite a bit with what Mircea Eliade was up to. And so I think we have here, and I'll conclude on that note, I have been much too verbose the last few occasions, that we have here a forgotten prophet. We have here a person of our culture who was of immense insight and whose insights and whose studies are worth exploring and internalizing in our time. Because once again, time, and here he was also a true Gnostic. The old Gnostics said that time is not real. Time is a counterfeit of reality. It is not only of reality, but of eternity. What we really seek is the eternal. And instead of that, we seek changes in time. We are never going to get to the eternal in that fashion. So really what runs through Mircea Eliade's work is that, look, humanity, you are really going in, or you have been going and you are going in the wrong direction. The shamans still knew what direction to go into. The medieval mystics still knew it. The yogis in India, where he was, knew it, But in our culture, we don't. We are running after will-o'-the-wisps. We are running after that which is not real, and in so doing, we miss the real. So for heaven's sakes, look. And the way he was trying to show this was in the history of spirituality, the history of religions. Look at it. You find it here, you find it there, that's what they were all trying to do. So why don't you try it? You see? But we don't. And then the various things, the tricks are immense. The tricks of history and the tricks of time, they come this way, they come as political ideology, of which he certainly experienced a good deal over there. It comes in all kinds of other ways. And it comes by getting scared. The terror of history. Now, I don't need to say much more about that. I think at this time in the era of the epidemics. But watch out. There will always be influences in the culture which, for reasons and unreason of their own, are trying to scare you. Why? Because when you're scared, you don't look for the real. No, all you are looking for is, gee whiz, am I going to get hurt, I'm going to get killed, I'm going to get this, that, and the other thing. And as Pope John Paul II, the great mystic, Il Gran Papa, as his successor called him, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It's the worst thing that you can do. It clouds your consciousness, it takes you away from the avenues where you might perchance come to your heart's desire. So what has started in a Victorian living room in Bucharest on a hot summer day behind the curtains became a philosophy of life, became a life's endeavor with this man who was trying to communicate to people that there is one tremendously important thing here, one great big treasure to which we are not addressing ourselves, primarily because we allow ourselves constantly to be distracted, diverted, and fooled. So I think we should be grateful for the fact that this strange romantic man, and I knew, I'm a Hungarian, I'm not from Transylvania, which became, but I knew a lot of Romanians. They were good friends of mine in exile in Austria and other places. It's particularly the Regat, the old Romania, which is done by the ocean and so forth. It's a very romantic spirit. And certainly Mircea Eliade had this. So let's try to rediscover him. He certainly wrote enough books. He certainly made a great imprint which in academic ways now seems to be vanishing. But I think in a spiritual way we should not allow it to vanish. Because somewhere there in the insides of that little Romanian boy who ended up in the Windy City by Lake Michigan, somehow there is a tremendously important insight. There is something there that if we could realize even to a degree, we would have done something tremendous, something marvelous, something that ought to be forever celebrated and remembered. So let's try. Let's pay homage to this man by trying what he was trying to convey and what he knew and what he promoted and what he wanted us to try. Let's try it, ladies and gentlemen. Let's try it. Thank you very much. And in so doing we lose our glasses. So next Friday we have the Qatar celebration, which I promise you is quite beautiful and will be of interest to you. And then we will have my countryman, the last one of the great mythologists, who really rediscovered the Eleusinian, the meaning of the Eleusinian mysteries. Very, very important discovery. Okay, thank you again.